Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something I think really, really interesting. El Salvador's approach to tackling gang violence. You've
Hmm.
probably heard about it in the news. Their crime rate has just plummeted,
Right.
but the methods they use have been, well, pretty controversial.
Yeah, for sure.
So, get this, their economy actually GER during this massive crackdown on gangs.
It is it's pretty surprising.
Wait, sounds crazy, right?
Yeah, it definitely goes against like what most people would expect. We
Yeah.
usually think about crime and the economy as being linked, right? Like more crime, worse economy.
Right, right.
But El Salvador seems to be turning that idea on its head.
Exactly. So, how did they do it? We've got some fascinating sources for this deep dive, including a recent speech by El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele,
Okay.
where he lays out his entire rationale.
Interesting.
It's a pretty bold strategy.
It really is. Um, to understand it, we need to go back a bit and look at the situation El Salvador was facing. So for decades, they'd been struggling with incredibly high levels of gang violence.
Okay. So, how bad was it? Paint us a picture.
Well, imagine this. These gangs had an estimated 70,000 members.
Whoa.
That's like a small army.
Yeah.
And they weren't just like hanging out on street corners. They were deeply embedded in the economy.
Wait, what do you mean embedded in the economy? I thought they were criminals.
They were, but they were running a whole like shadow economy.
Okay.
Think of it as a parallel system running alongside the legal one. So they were extorting businesses, controlling territory, and making a ton of money through illegal activities.
Wow.
And here's the thing, that money was flowing back into the regular economy. Like people were using it to buy groceries, clothes, pay rent, all the things we do every day.
So this shadow economy was actually impacting the country's GDP.
Absolutely. So GDP, or gross domestic product, is basically the total value of everything produced and sold in a country. And all that illegal activity was actually part of El Salvador's GDP.
Wow.
It's a concept that's hard to wrap your head around. Sometimes criminals contributing to the economy.
It's kind of mind-blowing. So the traditional approach would have been to try and dismantle these gangs slowly to minimize disruption, right?
Exactly. Most economists would advise a gradual approach, arguing that a sudden crackdown would cause a massive economic shock.
Hmm.
After all, if you suddenly cut off that flow of money from the shadow economy, businesses could collapse, people could lose their livelihoods.
Right.
It would be like pulling a rug out from under the whole system.
But Bukele basically said, nope, we're going all in.
Pretty much. He argued that this like slow and steady approach simply wouldn't work.
Okay.
He used a powerful analogy, treating gang violence like treating cancer. You can't just hope it goes away on its own or try to slowly chip away at it. You have to be aggressive and go for complete eradication, even if there are short-term side effects.
Okay. That's a pretty intense comparison. But how did he convince people to go along with this? It sounds like it would be pretty unpopular.
Well, that's where his economic argument comes in. He basically said that the short-term pain of this crackdown would be worth it for the long-term gain of a crime-free society. And to illustrate this point, he used this really interesting example of a young man choosing between selling tomatoes and joining a gang.
Wait, tomatoes?
Yeah.
Tell me more about this.
So imagine a young man in El Salvador. He has two options in front of him. He can work hard, wake up early every morning and try to make a living selling tomatoes.
Uh-huh.
Or he can join a gang, make easier money, and potentially have more power and status. Which path do you think he's more likely to choose?
Honestly, the gang option probably sounds pretty tempting in that situation.
Exactly. And that's what Bukele was getting at. He argued that the gangs had created a distorted system of incentives. The rewards for joining a gang outweighed the rewards for working a regular job. It was like the deck was stacked against anyone trying to make an honest living.
So Bukele's argument was that by eliminating the gangs, you change the entire equation.
Exactly. By removing the gang option, you suddenly make selling tomatoes a lot more appealing. You're not just cracking down on criminals. You're fundamentally shifting the incentives in the entire society.
Okay, I'm starting to see his logic here, but wasn't there a huge risk involved? I mean, even he admitted there'd be an economic cost to this approach, right?
He did. He estimated that the cost of this crackdown could be as high as 10% of El Salvador's GDP.
Whoa, that's a lot. So what happened? Did the economy tank as predicted?
It's actually pretty incredible. Instead of tanking, their economy actually grew by 3.5%.
Hold on, wait a minute. The economy GRU W, even with a 10% hit, how is that even possible?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It's what makes this whole story so fascinating.
Uh,
And it's why we're taking a deep dive into it today.
Right.
Because on the surface, it makes no sense.
Right.
But if you look closely at what Bukele did, it starts to become a little clearer.
Okay, so walk me through it. What was the secret sauce? Was it just about locking up gang members?
Well, that was definitely a huge part of it. They arrested thousands of gang members, disrupting their operations, weakening their control. But that was just the first step. Bukele knew that to truly solve the problem, he had to address the root causes that were driving people to join gangs in the first place.
So it was about more than just punishment.
Absolutely. It was about creating opportunities, especially for young people who were most at risk of being drawn into gang life. He invested heavily in education, job training programs, and social initiatives aimed at giving people a real alternative to the gang life.
Can you give me an example? What did these programs actually look like?
One program that stands out is called My New Life. It provides vocational training, life skills coaching, and job placement services to former gang members and at-risk youth. The goal is to equip them with the tools they need to build a stable and productive life outside of the gang.
Okay, that makes sense. But didn't some people criticize this approach? I feel like I've heard some things about human rights concerns.
There have definitely been concerns raised about potential human rights violations during the crackdown. Some critics argued that the government has overstepped its bounds and that innocent people have been caught up in the arrests.
So it sounds like a really complex situation with a lot of different viewpoints.
It definitely is, and that's part of what makes it so important to examine it carefully. It's not about taking sides, but about understanding all the different angles, the potential benefits, and the potential risks.
So going back to the economic piece of this puzzle, how did Bukele's approach actually lead to economic growth? I mean, even with those social programs, 10% of GDP is a big chunk of change.
Remember how we talked about the gangs having this huge impact on the legal economy?
Yeah.
Their extortion rackets were stifling businesses and discouraging investment. People were afraid to open shops, create jobs, or spend money because they were constantly being threatened. It was like this invisible hand holding the entire economy back.
Right. So by removing that threat, you essentially unlock the economy's potential.
Exactly. It's like taking the brakes off. When businesses feel safe and confident, they're more likely to invest, expand, and hire more people. And with those social programs in place, you're creating a more skilled and productive workforce. It's like a win-win situation.
So Bukele was betting that the economic benefits of a crime-free society would outweigh the short-term costs.
Exactly. And to a certain extent, it seems like his gamble paid off. Tourism has increased, foreign investment has started to flow back in, and there's this sense of optimism in El Salvador that hasn't been felt in decades.
Wow. Okay, this is all really fascinating stuff. But I have to ask, is this model replicable? Could other countries facing similar challenges just follow the El Salvador playbook and expect the same results?
That's the big question. It's still too early to say for sure whether this is a sustainable model, let alone one that can be replicated in other contexts. Every country is different, with its own unique set of challenges and circumstances.
So what are some of the factors that might make El Salvador a unique case?
Well, for one thing, Bukele has a very strong hold on power. He's a charismatic leader with a lot of popular support. That gives him a lot of leeway to implement these kinds of drastic measures.
That's a good point. It's not just about the policies themselves, but also about the political context in which they're being implemented.
Exactly. You also have to consider the size and scale of El Salvador. It's a relatively small country, which makes it easier to implement these kinds of sweeping changes. It might be much more difficult to replicate this in a larger and more complex country.
Okay, that makes sense. So even if it's not a perfect blueprint, it still feels like there are valuable lessons to be learned here.
Absolutely. El Salvador's experience shows us that sometimes you have to think outside the box. You can't always rely on the same old solutions to complex problems. You have to be willing to take risks, to try new things, and to be bold in your approach.
It's almost like a real-life experiment in social and economic engineering.
It really is. And it's fascinating to watch it unfold. But, like with any experiment, there are always unintended consequences.
Ooh, that sounds ominous. What do you mean?
Well, remember those 70,000 gang members we talked about? What happens to them now?
That's a great question. I was just thinking about that. They can't all stay locked up forever, can they?
Exactly. It's a really complex issue with no easy answers. Some people argue that these former gang members should be offered a path to redemption, like a chance to turn their lives around and become productive members of society.
Right.
Others believe they should face the full consequences of their actions, and remain incarcerated.
It sounds like finding the right balance between punishment and rehabilitation is going to be key to El Salvador's long-term success.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the individuals themselves, it's about the entire community.
Right.
Rebuilding trust, fostering forgiveness, and creating a sense of shared responsibility are going to be crucial for moving forward.
So where does this leave us? What are the key takeaways from our deep dive into El Salvador's experiment?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to tackling complex social problems like gang violence.
Yeah.
What worked in El Salvador
Yeah.
might not work somewhere else.
Right. But it still feels like there are some valuable lessons here.
Oh, yeah.
It shows that bold action can sometimes yield surprising results, and that addressing root causes is just as important as law enforcement when it comes to creating lasting change.
Absolutely. El Salvador's story challenges us to rethink our assumptions,
Yeah.
about crime and punishment, about economics and development, and about the role of government in shaping society.
It definitely leaves us with more questions than answers, but I think that's the beauty of the deep dive. We're not here to give you all the answers, but to spark your curiosity, to make you think critically, and to encourage you to keep exploring these complex issues on your own.
Yeah, for sure.
Because ultimately, these aren't just academic debates, they're real-world challenges that affect real people's lives.
Right.
And it's up to all of us to engage with these issues thoughtfully and to work towards creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Well said.
So keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep diving deep.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into El Salvador. Till next time.
See you then.